At the dawn of industrialization, corporations didn't distinguish between financial and management accounting. Some would say management accounting didn't exist until Taylor introduced scientific management, which eventually resulted in the idea of a standard cost. Regardless, the notion of management control systems didn't exist back then. Practices changed, however. DuPont was a big American company and one of the first diversified companies we know of. A diversified company has many business units doing different things. Management practice used to be that the team you see in this photo would travel around between the different business units to actually look into the accounts of each subsidiary. One day, however, the CEO fell ill and asked his controller, Donaldson Brown, who's the guy in the gray suit, to develop a system that would allow him to control the entire company basically from at home. Donaldson Brown introduced what has later become known as the DuPont pyramid, which is the return on investment calculation. What you see in this photo is the chart room at DuPont. Here, the controllers would sit and do a calculation every month for each of the business units. You might be able to see some of the signs such as gunpowder, paint, coatings, etc. But basically, each business unit had its own ROI chart. They were updated continuously, and this is what the controller's job was back then. The photo on the previous page contained the ROI pyramid up in the left corner. It is pictured here on the slide as well, and what you see in the following is the design of the ROI pyramid. The idea of this design was that all subsidiaries would report in cost of goods sold, selling expenses, administrative expenses, the cash position, etc., and nothing more. On that basis, the controllers at the headquarters would do the calculation of margin and turnover and subsequently the ROI. With the ROI calculation, a management control system had been invented. What you have here on this photo looks pretty much like a dry cleaner's shop. The idea of this was that management from now on would sit together once a month and look at the ROI performance of each subsidiary in order to make decisions about the resource allocation. Therefore, the communication from each subsidiary was now basically reduced to a graph. That was the development on the margin and the turnover and the ROI. At DuPont, there were specific rules for the use of this new management control system. The first rule was to create a complete absence of narratives. DuPont didn't want explanations from the subsidiaries, but only numbers. The second rule was to create a focus on the ease at which the entire management group could be held to one item, which was the ROI. That was to make sure that everyone looked at the same and discussed the same. The third rule was to define a system or rules that more or less rigidly would govern the assembly of data, and that's a pyramid, so that we would be fairly clear on how the ROI was actually calculated. The fourth rule was to maintain strict adherence to the format until something better would come along. And fifth and finally, but perhaps also most importantly, the idea of this management control system was to make sure that all decisions were made by the executive committee, which is what we today call the management board. In that sense, DuPont, at the time when the ROI calculation was introduced, was a top-driven company. Stop here for a minute and think about the following assignment. The principles listed on the previous page suggest something about the management system or the management control system at DuPont. What do you think that is? Secondly, how does the system differ from the controls used during early industrialization? In parallel with these developments, business schools started popping up. They developed programs in business administration, and the significance of that was that now suddenly accounting information was put in context. Managers were trained to analyze financial statements, and the whole point of that was actually to turn focus away from accounting and over to managerial decision-making. Moving 50 years ahead, Robert Anthony published the first book on management control systems in 1965. His publication is still to this day seen as very significant because Anthony was the first scholar to emphasize the use of accounting data over the techniques for gathering these data. Anthony's mantra was that the raison d'etre of accounting was planning and control. As a novelty, Anthony suggested to distinguish control in terms of three layers: strategic planning, management control, and operational control. He defined strategic planning as the process of deciding on objectives of the organization, on changes in these objectives, and on the policies that are to govern the acquisition, use, and disposition of company resources. Strategic planning, in that sense, encompasses setting of long-term goals and objectives, as well as the formulation of long-range plans and policies for the whole organization. Vice versa, operational control was the process of assuring that specific tasks were carried out effectively and efficiently. Activities related to operational control involve particular tasks or transactions whose accomplishment one could evaluate and measure objectively. The ROI system from Dechow, in that sense, would fit the description of operational controls. Finally, and most importantly, Anthony suggested that management control is a process that connects strategies and strategic planning and operational control. In this second assignment, I want you to compare the approach by Donaldson Brown and the one by Robert Anthony. I'm curious about the differences that you observe and what might explain this difference. Let's move 30 years ahead to 1995. Robert Simons introduced a system called levels of control. In his view, business strategy is what results from what he referred to as four types of systems, namely belief, boundary, interactive, and diagnostic control systems. The idea of these levels of control is similar to the idea of yin and yang, that there are some that are positive and reinforcing, empowering, and that there are other systems that are coercive. In the graphic on this page, you see the coercive systems, in that sense, on the right side, being boundary systems and diagnostic control systems, and the enabling systems, on the left side, being belief systems and interactive control systems. Arguably, one can discuss whether such a stylized representation of systems as either enabling or coercive is correct. Nevertheless, the idea of that was to say that if we look at the way that we control people by putting pressure on them, but also giving them opportunities, then we can find out what the space is for corporate strategy. Arguably, Simon's levels of control system is not the only concept introduced since 1965. What makes Simon's approach different is that he introduced a life cycle perspective on management controls. As he points out in this graphic here, is that small startups actually probably don't really need management control systems, but as they grow, we actually see that other types of systems become important in order to manage the company. The startup perhaps starts with a belief, but as we start growing, the belief is not enough. We need to set some strategic boundaries, and we bring about some diagnostics. Ultimately, the point is simple. What he points out is that a full-blown management control systems of belief systems, boundary systems, diagnostic systems, and interactive systems probably only exist in mature companies. In this third assignment, I want you to think about Simons in relation to both the Dechow system and the idea of management control systems introduced by Anthony. Ultimately, the question is Simon's framework a supplement to existing ideas, or is it an alternative? Look at it There certainly are some differences. Simon's levels of control framework, for example, differs from the one seen previously because they tended to focus on outcomes. But what does Simon's focus on? By now, this snapshot on management control systems has introduced you to 3 different ideas. First, we had the idea by Donaldson Brown to create an ROI calculation. Then, we had the introduction by Robert Anthony suggesting that management control systems is what you have in between strategic planning and operational control. Third, we had the systems by Robert Simons, which introduced notions such as belief systems, interactive control systems, boundary systems, and diagnostic control systems. Effectively, what you have now seen by these 3 systems is a conglomeration of different types of control. Some of them concern themselves with results control, some concern themselves with action controls and cultural controls. Merchant and Van der Stede summarized this in 2003. A takeaway from now should be that the notion of management control systems is not similar to an IT system. Management control systems are like a package of different types of management initiatives. Some concern planning, some concern control, some concern recurring events of control, or what you could refer to as cybernetic systems, and some refer to inspirational systems that we use every now and then. In other words, management control systems is a fairly broad term that does not denote only one specific approach to management accounting. Malmy and Brown are 2 scholars who set themselves the goal of putting together all these different definitions of management control systems that have been produced throughout time. One of the points, or perhaps the central point, is that we need to see management control system as a package, encompassing or spanning over everything from organizational controls, cybernetic controls, and administrative controls. Management control systems, in other words, is everything we do in order to have an ordered reality in organizations. In this 4th assignment, I would like you to think about the following. If management control systems is basically just a label for a package of management initiatives, is it important to still talk about management control systems or not? First, I would like you to think about this point from the perspective of accounting information. Then, I would like you to consider the takeaway the notion of management control system has offered us. As we are about to come to an end, I would like you to think about management control systems in the cycle of evolution. We may be about to enter a new phase, and once again, we are at the point where we have to look at management control systems in terms of innovation and control. 1914, Donaldson Brown introduced something that proved to be revolutionary. What is next? 2021. Arguably, the need for time motion studies, as introduced by Taylor under the bans of scientific management, are no longer needed. Production is increasingly automated and done by robots. Would that change management control? Public debate has brought about new concepts. One is footprint, another is impact, and I'm sure there's a lot of other concepts already out there or about to be introduced. We now care about companies in a different way than we cared about them before. Arguably, ROI is still important, but so is the impact that the company has on society, on nature. Question is, do we already know how to account for the footprint of a company? Here, at the ultimate end of this snapshot on management control systems, I would like you to think about how notions such as footprint and impact might influence the future development of management control systems. The scene is yours.